You're still waiting for permission. Carl Jung. Carl Jung observed that the modern person has quietly handed the pen of his own life to someone else, and calls the empty page patience, and calls the waiting wisdom, and never notices the theft happening in plain daylight. As Jung wrote in what became one of his last major works, The Undiscovered Self, he named the condition plainly: people will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls. That line comes from Collected Works Volume 12, paragraph 126. And it names something you already feel. The permission you are waiting for is not missing. It was never going to come, because the whole arrangement was built so it never would. The waiting itself is the avoidance, dressed up as humility, dressed up as respect for process, dressed up as simply being a reasonable person who does not act until told. Before we go further, if you want tomorrow's teaching to actually reach you instead of getting lost in the feed, this is a good moment to subscribe, so the next piece of this finds you when you need it. The first key is this: permission was never yours to receive, because it was never anyone's to give. Jung spent the last years of his life worried about something he called mass-mindedness, the slow erosion of the individual into what he termed statistical man, the average, the composite, the person who no longer decides, because deciding has been quietly outsourced to the group, to the department, to the committee, to whoever seems to be standing closest to authority. And here is where it gets personal. Think of the Tuesday you actually had, the email you drafted and did not send until someone else weighed in, the idea you sat on until your manager nodded, the decision about your own life, your own name on it, that you would not act on until a parent or a partner or a vague sense of the room gave the signal. Notice the shape of it more closely. Imagine standing in a doorway with your coat already on, keys in hand, and still you wait one more minute, checking your phone, hoping some small sign will arrive to make the leaving official. No one taught you this in words, and yet you learned it perfectly, that a decision does not feel real until it has been witnessed and blessed by someone standing outside it. That is not modesty, that is postponement of yourself onto a fiction called statistical man, a person who does not exist and therefore can never actually approve anything. You have been waiting in that doorway for years, coat on, keys in hand, for a sign that was never going to walk through the door because there was no one behind it to send one. So speak this with me. I stop waiting for a stamp that was never coming. I decide. I stop waiting for a stamp that was never coming. I decide. The second key is this: the choice you keep deferring is heavier than you think. And here is the reversal. You assume your one decision does not matter enough to make alone, that surely it needs a second signature, a committee, a consensus, because who are you to just decide? Jung named this precisely. In The Undiscovered Self he wrote of the make-weight, the small weight that tips the scale. He was writing about how history itself turns not on grand movements, but on the accumulated private choices of people who believed their choice was too small to count. Imagine the scale in an old apothecary shop, nearly balanced, brass arms trembling slightly, and one small coin dropped on one side is what finally moves it. That coin is not nothing. That coin is everything, and it is exactly the size of one ordinary decision made without asking anyone. Now imagine a woman standing in her kitchen on an ordinary Sunday. She has wanted to leave a job that has quietly hollowed her out for 3 years. She has told herself she is waiting for the right time, waiting until her savings look a little better, waiting until her partner agrees it is wise, waiting until a friend who has done something similar gives her the nod that it worked out fine for them too. None of these are wrong to want, but notice what is actually happening underneath. She has turned her own life into a scale that only moves when enough other people lean on it with her, and so it never moves, because everyone else is waiting on their own scale too. The coin that would tip it was always sitting in her own hand. So ask yourself plainly, where in your week did you do this same thing? The meeting where you stayed quiet because your view felt too minor to interrupt with. The family dinner where you let the old verdict about you stand unchallenged because correcting it felt like too much for one person to carry. You were the make-weight both times, And both times, you set yourself down on the side of the scale marked weight. This is not modesty. It is not proof of your smallness. It is proof you have been persuaded of a smallness you do not actually have. Jung's point was never that the crowd is powerful and the individual is weak. It was the opposite, that the crowd only appears powerful because so many individuals have quietly declined to place their own small coin on the scale. So speak this with me. My quiet choices are not small. They tip the scale. My quiet choices are not small. They tip the scale. The third key is this. The herd feels safer than the self. And this is worth sitting with, because it explains why the waiting persists, even after you can name it. Jung opened the undiscovered self by describing something almost primitive in us, the way a crowd gives its members a strange sensation of anonymous immortality. Inside the group, no one signs their name to the outcome, so no one feels the full weight of it. Imagine a committee deciding something difficult. The decision gets made, and afterward, if you ask who is responsible, the answer dissolves into everyone and no one. That dissolving feeling is not an accident. It is the whole appeal. The crowd is a shelter built out of shared blame, or rather the absence of it. And this is why waiting for permission feels so much safer than deciding alone. If you wait for the department to approve it, and it goes wrong, it was the department's failure. If you wait for your family to bless the move, and it falls apart, it was never fully your decision. So you are protected. But notice the cost. Protected from what exactly? From the discomfort of being the one who chose. And that discomfort, uncomfortable as it is also the only doorway into a life that is actually yours. A decision made entirely inside the shelter of the group is a decision that was never really made by you at all. It was made by the average of everyone in the room, and you simply agreed to disappear into it. Think of the ordinary version of this. Imagine a small group of co-workers standing around a printer. Someone says, "The new policy is unworkable." Another nods. A third adds a detail that confirms it, and within a minute, the whole group is certain. Not because any one of them examined the policy closely, but because the certainty passed hand to hand, the way warmth passes through a huddle. No single person in that circle decided anything, and yet every one of them now feels entitled to the opinion, as though they had reasoned their way to it privately. This is the anonymous immortality Jung described, wearing its most ordinary disguise, standing by a printer instead of marching in a square. And it is comfortable precisely because nobody there has to defend the view alone later. If it turns out to be wrong, it belongs to the huddle, not to any one face in it. Now turn this toward your own waiting. The reason the permission never quite arrives is that some part of you has already calculated, correctly, that deciding alone means owning the outcome alone. So you keep circling back toward the group, toward the family, toward the committee, toward some version of consensus, hoping the weight will be shared before you move. But consensus of that kind is not wisdom. It is distributed cowardice, dressed respectably. And Jung was gentle about naming this. He did not call it a moral failing so much as an ancient reflex, older than reason, older than conscience, a survival habit from a time when standing apart from the group could genuinely cost you your life. The reflex is not stupid. It is simply out of date. It protected the body once, and now it only protects you from the ordinary discomfort of being visibly, singularly responsible for your own choice. Recognizing this in yourself is not an accusation. It is the first real look at the mechanism. So speak this with me. I choose responsibility over the shelter of the crowd. I choose responsibility over the shelter of the crowd. The fourth key is this. The waiting spreads the way an illness spreads. And Jung had a phrase for this in his later writing, Collected in the Symbolic Life. He called it a psychic epidemic. Not a metaphor exactly, a real description of how a whole population can catch the same unexamined certainty at the same time, the way a fever passes hand to hand. An opinion is caught the same way a cold is caught. Not reasoned toward but absorbed from proximity. And this matters for you personally, because some of what you are waiting for permission to override is not even your own judgment. It is a borrowed certainty you picked up from a headline, a group chat, A relative's flat pronouncement said once at a holiday table and never questioned since. Imagine a woman named nothing in particular, sitting at her mother's table every autumn for 15 years, and one year, deep in a conversation about nothing much, her mother says offhand that people in their family are not the sort who start over, that they finish what they begin, and that is that. No one argues, no one even really hears it. The plates get cleared, the sentence sinks quietly into the woman like a stone into still water, and 11 years later, sitting on the floor of an apartment she no longer wants to live in, weighing whether to leave a marriage or a career that has gone hollow, she finds herself saying almost the exact sentence to her own reflection: people like us do not start over. She does not remember where it came from. She only knows it feels true, feels like bedrock, feels like her own considered wisdom arrived at through years of living. But it is not her wisdom at all. It is a fever she caught at a dinner table before she was even old enough to test it. This is how it works. Notice how certain you are about something in your life right now. Your career path, whether you are too old to start over, whether your art or your business or your marriage decision needs outside approval before it counts. And then ask honestly, where did that certainty actually come from? Did you arrive at it through your own wrestling, through your own failures and second attempts, or did you simply catch it from the air around you, the way you catch a tone of voice, without ever deciding to, this is the beginning of what I will call an opinion provenance audit. Take one belief you are currently obeying without appeal, one rule you have never once questioned, and trace it backward like a detective tracing a fingerprint. Who said it first? In what room? In what tone? Did you ever actually test it against your own experience? Or did you just inherit it the way you inherit a coat left behind by someone else? A coat that does not quite fit through the shoulders, but is warm enough, familiar enough, that you never bothered taking it off. You have been wearing opinions that were never tailored to you, and calling the discomfort character, calling the poor fit tradition. Most of what feels like your considered judgment is in fact a psychic epidemic you caught early, long before you had any immunity, and never got tested for since. And here is the quiet trap inside all of this. The epidemic does not feel like illness from the inside. Illness usually announces itself. A fever makes you feel unwell, but a borrowed certainty feels like clarity. It feels like knowing. It feels exactly the way your own hard-won wisdom would feel, which is precisely why it is so rarely questioned. You do not doubt a thought that arrives already dressed as truth, and the permission you are waiting for, the nod you keep hoping someone will give you before you finally act, is very often just waiting for that borrowed opinion to loosen its grip and release you, which it will not do on its own. A coat does not take itself off. Someone wearing it has to decide the room is warmer than they thought. So this week, choose one sentence you have said about yourself more than once, one of the flat little laws you live by without appeal, and ask plainly whose voice was actually behind it first. So speak this with me. I trace my opinions back to their source before I keep them. I trace my opinions back to their source before I keep them. The fifth key is this, and here the lens has to turn, because up to now it has been easy to nod along, thinking of the mass man as other people, the committee, the crowd, the anonymous them out there who avoid deciding. But ask yourself honestly, whose hand you actually imagined holding the pen over your own unsigned page? Was it a boss you have not spoken to in years? A parent whose voice you can still hear correcting you at 14? An old teacher? A version of your community that may not even think about you anymore? Picture the actual object, the manuscript sitting in the bottom drawer, the business plan open in a document you have not touched in months, the apology you have rehearsed but never delivered, the return to the instrument, or the canvas, or the degree you set down years ago. In every one of these, there is a permission you have decided must arrive before you begin, and Jung's whole warning about mass-mindedness applies just as much inside a private mind as inside a stadium of thousands. The mass man is not only the person swept up in a crowd, he is also the private person who has appointed an imagined committee inside his own skull and refuses to act until that committee, which exists nowhere but in his own memory, gives its verdict. This is the mass-mindedness operating in miniature, in your own kitchen, at your own desk, at 2 in the morning when the idea is loudest and the imagined committee is silent because it was never real to begin with. Now picture it in full detail, because the picture is where the spell breaks. Imagine sitting at the kitchen table long after everyone else has gone to bed, the laptop open, the cursor blinking in an email you have drafted 11 separate times, and notice who you are actually picturing reading it before you send it. It is rarely the actual person the email is addressed to. It is a tribunal of faces stitched together from your whole history. An old supervisor who once raised an eyebrow at your idea in a meeting 9 years ago. A sibling who called you impractical at a dinner you can still feel in your stomach. A version of your own father at a certain age. None of them summoned by you on purpose. All of them simply present, the way old furniture is present in a house you inherited. And you are asking their permission to send an email none of them will ever read. That tribunal never announces itself as fictional. It never says, "I am only a memory, be careful trusting me." It simply sits there in judges' robes made of nothing, and you keep addressing your motion to a bench that adjourned years ago and never told you. Notice too how this borrows its shape from something larger, the way people now wait for a certain number of people to agree before they will believe their own eyes. The way an idea does not feel true until enough others have nodded at it first. That same appetite for a verdict from elsewhere lives just as strongly in private, quietly, at your own desk, where no one else is even watching. This is the mass-mindedness Jung named, but shrunk down to the size of one nervous system, one drawer, one blinking cursor. And the strange comedy of it is that the committee you are so carefully deferring to would very likely be startled to learn it still has this power over you at all. Most of its members have moved on entirely, thinking about their own unsent emails, their own drawers, their own imagined juries. So this week, name the actual waiting, not vaguely, specifically. Name the one thing you have been postponing pending someone else's nod, and then do the smaller, honest work of tracing whether that someone is even watching or thinking about you at all. Write down the face you picture when you hesitate, and then ask plainly whether that face has any actual authority over the paper in front of you, or only the authority you have kept renewing on its behalf without noticing the renewal. In most cases, you will find the hand you were waiting on was a memory, not a person, a fossil of an old authority, still granted veto power over a life it no longer has any stake in. And once you see that clearly, the pen in your own hand stops looking borrowed. So speak this with me. I am the one withholding my own permission, so I grant it. I am the one withholding my own permission, so I grant it. The sixth key is this, and it is the deepest one, because Jung did not end the undiscovered self with a warning only. He ended it with a counterweight. He wrote that against the pull of the mass, the only real resistance is the individual who has become, in his words, as well organized in his individuality as the mass is organized in its collectivity. That comes from chapter 4 of that book, and it means something specific. It does not mean becoming stubborn, or isolated, or contrarian for its own sake. It means becoming a person with an actual center, a conscience that has been tested against your own experience rather than simply inherited, a set of convictions you can name the origin of, because you did the work of tracing them. Think of it this way. A crowd is organized from the outside in. A slogan arrives, a uniform arrives, a shared enemy arrives, and thousands of people snap into formation around something none of them built themselves. The individual Jung describes is organized the opposite way. From the inside out, the center comes first, and only from that center does any action follow. And here is the plain test. When the center is missing, a person needs the outside structure to hold him together at all. Take away the job title, take away the family role, take away the room full of people nodding along, and there is nothing left standing on its own. That collapse is not a character flaw. It is simply what happens when the organizing principle was borrowed rather than built. Imagine a man who spent 30 years as the reliable one at his company, the one everyone deferred to, the one whose approval mattered in every meeting. And then he retires, and within a year, He is lost in his own house, irritable, aimless, asking his wife what he is supposed to do with a Tuesday. Nothing outward failed him. No tragedy struck. What failed was that his sense of himself had been organized entirely by the mass around him, the title, the deference, the room, and once the room was gone, there was no self underneath it that had ever been asked to stand on its own. This is what Jung meant by mass-mindedness operating even in a single life. It does not require a stadium. It only requires that a person's center of gravity sit outside himself. Now compare that to what Jung actually lived. He had, by his own account, a public professional persona and what he privately called his number two personality, the older, quieter part of him that did not need the room to agree before it knew what it thought. He did not discard the public role. He needed it. He simply refused to let it be the only floor he stood on. And that is the real meaning of individuation here, not rejecting society, not becoming a hermit on a hillside, but building underneath the roles a floor that does not depend on anyone else's vote to hold your weight. This is what allows him to write, without contradiction, that the well-organized individual is the only real counterweight to the mass, because the mass moves by contagion, and contagion needs a host with no immunity. A person who has done this quiet inner organizing has, in effect, developed an immunity, not to influence entirely, no one is immune to that, but to the specific illness of needing the crowd's nod before he can act at all. He can hear the committee's opinion and simply not need its verdict, which is a very different thing from ignoring it out of spite. So bring this back to the exact decision you named a moment ago. The manuscript, the apology, the return to the canvas. Ask yourself plainly, if every person who might have approved this vanished tomorrow, the old boss, the parent, the vague sense of your community watching, would the thing still matter to you? If the answer is yes, that is the flaw Jung is describing. That is the self that was there before the waiting started. And it has been there the whole time, underneath the asking, patient, unimpressed by how long you kept it waiting. I want to be honest with you here rather than flattering. This is not a scheduled awakening that arrives on a fixed timeline. And there is no elder committee anywhere that is going to retroactively bless the years you already spent waiting. That part cannot be recovered. Only the years ahead can be lived differently. So this week, take one decision you have been holding for outside approval, something real, not hypothetical, and give yourself the small discomfort of deciding it plainly. Notice what happens in your chest. Notice that the sky does not fall. Notice that the imagined committee, when you finally check, was not even in session. So speak this with me. I stand as one, organized within, and the mass cannot move me. I stand as one, organized within, and the mass cannot move me. Here is the whole picture. The permission was never anyone's to give. Your quiet choices tip the scale whether you claim them or not. The crowd offers shelter, but the shelter costs you your own name on your own life. Opinions spread like fever, and deserve to be traced before they are obeyed. The hand you were waiting on was very often a memory, and not a person, and the only real answer to mass-mindedness is a person who has quietly organized himself from the inside, which is not arrogance. It is simply no longer asking a question that was never going to be answered. If any part of this named something you have been sitting with, comment the two words "face it," so I know this one landed where it needed to. You were never actually waiting for permission. You were waiting for a version of yourself brave enough to stop asking for it.